Hi, and welcome to my prelude on the Civil War. Let's just jump straight in. So, uh, the big issue with slavery was that it was never addressed right at the start. The Constitution never specifically banned slavery. There were three clauses specifically about it, and all of them were basically just workarounds. The Three-Fifths Compromise, of course, just to get rid of the whole population difference. Fugitive Slave Act, and they added in that the slave trade will end in 20 years after the Constitution gets ratified. These three things were added in because the Founding Fathers were basically just too scared to outright ban slavery. They knew that this Constitution would never pass if they did that, even if they wanted to. I mean, some of them didn't even want to. So it was major, basically just they were just too scared, basically. The next big issue was King Cotton. So by 1861, cotton was the American export. Eli Whitney, who was a Connecticut citizen, his cotton gin quickened harvest by over 1,000%. A big issue with cotton, though, is that it completely destroyed soil in the farms because they did not practice crop rotation or anything like that. So they basically just moved through the land as they went, and it spurred westward movement because as they destroyed the land, they're like, oh, where are we going to go next? The west. One of the first big ordinances was the Northwest Ordinance, and it was first to suffer the problem of what do we do with it in terms of slavery. And since it was in the Northwest and slavery wasn't going to be huge in these territories, slavery was outlawed. And it also raised the question of should we bring them in immediately as states, or should the territories become colonies first? And they decided that after colonies reached a population of over 60,000, then they would make them as states. Next came the southern equivalent, the Southwest Ordinance, and basically the same thing, except slavery was allowed. The major crisis we want to remember out of, or the first big major crisis, though, is the Missouri Crisis in 1820. So this was basically just a reaction of the North and Southwest Ordinance. Missouri was a territory and a colony that wanted to reach the 60,000 population and wanted to become a state. The thing is, it wanted to become a slave state, and what that meant was it would upset the equilibrium of Congress. At that point, there was an equal amount of representation for both the North and South in terms of slave states. And if Missouri came in as a slave state, there would now be more slave states than free states. And the North did not want this. It was a huge upset and outcry, and eventually the Missouri Compromise came along. And the decision made it so that Missouri could come in as a slave state, but they would also bring in Maine as a completely new state, which would be free. And this would sort of reset the balance. In addition, they created the 3630 line, which basically meant that every state that would come in the future, underneath 3630 line, would be slave state. Every state above it would be free state. The next big issue would actually come much later on, and this was in 1848 with Texas. Texas, we gained it during the Mexican-American War, and we also gained a massive piece of land from our victory. And at the time, President Taylor wanted to make Texas a state immediately, and his plan was to admit New Mexico along with it. The issue here was that, and this is what made the South really mad at him, Texas and New Mexico both would probably outlaw slavery. So it wouldn't even be an equilibrium thing. It would just completely upset the balance, and the South did not want that. And before he could even put his plans in motion, he died of gastric poisoning. A lot of people, in recent studies came up about this, thought that he was actually poisoned by somebody else. That would make it the first presidential assassination. But that was disproven, sadly, because that would have been an amazing story. The new compromise that came out of it instead was the Compromise of 1850. This admitted California as a free state and Texas as a slave state, and it organized the New Mexico Territory and created a new fugitive slave law. And the North hated this. They basically just had to play policeman for the South now for any slaves that went to the North. And this raised tensions between the two sides. The next big thing was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This really just kind of tipped the scales. So one big issue with westward territories is where are we gonna put the Transcontinental Railroad, and are we gonna put it in Kansas or Nebraska? And the act that came out of this was repealed the 3630 line and gave Kansas popular sovereignty instead, which basically meant that they could choose if they wanted to a free state or a slave state. It was a huge miscalculation, and people rushed in from both sides trying to occupy the state in order to make it a free or slave state, and it ended up in just an eruption of violence called Bleeding Kansas. This is where John Brown had his famous raid on Harper's Ferry, where he beheaded 5 pro-slavery guards. And this is the first time in all of America's history where there was a huge just fury over slavery. Next was the Brooks-Sumner beating. Now, this is just interesting. It really sort of indicates just how high the tensions were getting between North and South in Cotton, because Charles Sumner, who was a Northern representative, was beaten with a cane in the middle of Congress by Preston Brooks, who was a Southern representative, over a 2-day slavery speech that insulted his uncle. Charles Sumner really just went off one day in Congress and pissed a lot of people off. So, I guess it came back to bite him. Brooks was banned from Congress, but the South just immediately immortalized him. They loved him. They sent hundreds of canes to his house as gifts. And once again, the North was just horribly angry at this. Like, how could these dirty Southerners do this to Congress? This is an outrage. Then came the Dred Scott decision. Even still today, it's recognized as one of the biggest court decisions in American history. And it ruled that no black person is a true citizen in the United States. And that meant that blacks therefore had no protective services under law and in court. And then as an added caveat, it made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So it just kind of threw a lot of things up in the air. People really didn't know what to do with it. And it kind of served towards the next thing, the political atmosphere. So at the time, there were 2 major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Whigs had disintegrated in the earlier 1800s, and a lot of them formed the Republican Party, which was new. And the right-wing Republicans were just complete abolitionists, and people hated them. The Republicans even refused to acknowledge that they were part of their party. Moderates, and this is what Lincoln was, they viewed that slavery was immoral, but it was constitutional. And then conservatives just wanted to preserve the Union, and they didn't really care about anything else. The Democrats, though, they actually ended up splitting in half over slavery in 1858, and this is what leads to Lincoln being elected. They have the identity crisis lasts throughout the war, too. With the split between the North and the South getting wider and wider, the split between the Democrats got wider and wider, too. So it just really didn't help their case. Lincoln's election. So with that party split, Lincoln runs for the Republican nomination, wins, and then runs for the presidential election and wins. Imagine if you lived in a state and you're voting for somebody and somebody else gets elected that you never even had on your ballot. And they just pretty much didn't exist to you. That's what happened to the South. And it just became an uproar. And South Carolina held its first secession convention and decided to secede from the Union. And by the time Lincoln even takes the oath of office, over 7 states have seceded. And in his inaugural address, he basically just pleaded like for the South to return willingly and for peace to come back. He didn't want this at all, but they didn't really listen. And so in April of 1861, they opened fire on Fort Sumter, triggering the Civil War. So that's basically a lot of the background on the Civil War. I know it's a lot to take in. This video is pretty long, but trust me when I say this is just the very specific points. I could go all day about this stuff. But you're going to have to go on to the next video if you want to hear more about the Civil War.